Okay, so when we talk about this Irish literary revival, right? We're talking about a movement that lasts from about the 1880s into the early years of the 20th century. And by the early 20th century kind of peters out, as most of the early figures associated with it either pass away or move on to other things, right? You may have noticed, for example, that the early Yeats poems that you read, like The Stolen Child and The Man Who Dreamed of Fairyland, are quite different in tone and content from the later poems like Easter 1916 and The Second Coming, right? I imagine you probably found Easter 1916 and The Second Coming a little bit more obscure, right? And some of that is because Easter 1916 requires some specific historical knowledge of Ireland to understand, which we will get to, we will discuss. And The Second Coming is an expression of Yeats's own bizarre occult philosophy, which we will also explain as best we can, because it's batshit crazy. But yeah, so this literary revival is part of a larger complex of cultural movements within Irish life in the late 19th century, which included, as Kyla mentioned, the Gaelic League. Now, the Gaelic League was devoted to the revival specifically of the Irish language, which by the 1880s was still really only spoken much in the rural West, right? So in the Irish imagination of the late 19th century, Ireland kind of gets divided into two halves. So we'll draw our vaguely potato-shaped island again here. Any resemblance to the actual island of Ireland is purely coincidental. So the East is comparatively urbanized and industrialized. I say comparatively because Ireland remains into the mid-20th century primarily an agricultural country, right? They have a primarily agricultural economy. All right, with this culture kind of centered on Dublin, the capital right around here. The west of Ireland remains rural, agricultural, and for the most part, Irish-speaking. So for the nationalist movement that favors the construction of a separate Irish identity, right, as something that's distinct from a British identity, the West becomes the kind of idealized location of the true heart of Ireland, right? And I put true in quotes here because, absolutes are always questionable. Now, these three little islands that I've drawn over here are called the Aran Islands. And these islands in particular become a kind of pilgrimage place, particularly for urban Easterners who want to reconnect in some way with Ireland. Now remember this because it will be important when we read Joyce for next time, right? This is kind of the significance of the Aran Islands, right? The true hearts of nationalist peasant Ireland, right? The Gaelic League, which promotes the speaking of the Irish language, even though some of its founders are Protestants, comes to be associated primarily with the Catholic middle class, as indeed most political nationalist activity does. So while they're holding up the West as an ideal, most of the real nationalist political activity is happening in urban centers like Dublin, right? So we talked a little bit about how after about 1850, what happened to the population of Ireland? What do we remember from last time?
You said that after 1850?
After 1850, yep.
You said that it started to decrease?
Yeah, it decreased significantly, right, over the course of the 1840s, right? From 8 million people in 1840 to about 6.5 million people by 1851. And it continues to decrease over the course of the 19th century. Does anybody remember what happened?
You said
about with the potatoes, they couldn't grow.
yeah.
Yeah, there were several years of potato blight in the 1840s. So the potato crop failed, which meant that the poorest people in Ireland had nothing to eat, right? So then, who dies or is forced to emigrate primarily? If we're thinking in terms of social classes.
The low class people?
Yeah, people from the lower socioeconomic brackets, right? So people who are, kind of subsistence farmers or farm laborers, right, are the people who suffer most. So what that leaves is a depopulated rural West and a kind of ascendant middle class urban East, right? So apart from the fact that they remain Catholic, the Irish middle class comes to resemble, in many respects, in terms of its values and its practices, the English Victorian middle class, right? We're talking about sort of, people who work in the professions, doctors and lawyers, people who own, groceries or pubs or things like that, right? And so while they develop a sense of kind of separate national pride, at the same time, their values in terms of gender relationships, in terms of basic morality, are essentially Victorian, right? So we still see that very much kind of that's kind of separate spheres kind of mentality, particularly like in things like relations between men and women, right? And Irish Catholicism, having been kind of stripped of the pagan element that the poorer practitioners of the rural West brought to it, the holy wells and the thorn trees and all that, also becomes much more conservative, particularly in regards to personal morality. And also kind of takes tighter control over the population. So what happens by the 1880s then is we have these writers and cultural figures like Yeats. Yeats doesn't fit into this particular group. Yeats is of Anglo-Irish descent. Now, do we remember what Anglo-Irish meant from last time? Who or what are the Anglo-Irish? Pardon?
Like English.
Yeah, they're people who live in Ireland but are of English descent, right? And they're predominantly Protestant. Most of the landlord class, and indeed most of the professional class, is made up of people of Anglo-Irish background, right? So there isn't much place for an Anglo-Irish artist in this kind of like late 19th century bourgeois Ireland of kind of stifling conformity and morality, right? So what Yeats and some of his peers do, so Yeats is one of the prime movers here, but other important figures are Douglas Hyde, who was a language scholar who Kyla mentioned in her presentation, Lady Gregory, the novelist George Moore, the playwright Edward Martin, and the poet Catherine Tynan. Aim to create a vision of Irish culture that is not dependent on Catholicism for determining its separateness from England, right? And this group includes a mix of Catholic and Protestant writers. Yeats, Hyde, Gregory are Protestants. Moore, Martin, and Tynan are Catholics, though they do all come more or less from the upper moneyed classes. So, the aim of their movement is what we call cultural nationalism, which was sometimes allied to and sometimes not allied to political nationalist movements in Ireland at the same time. And they're trying to create a cultural nationalist movement that is less exclusive than the Gaelic League, because it's welcoming to people who still want to speak English. And their aim is to create a distinctly Irish literature in the English language. So how are they doing that? Well, primarily by going backwards to the period before the split between Catholics and Protestants, right? So they're reaching back to Irish mythology and Irish folklore. To emphasize a heritage that can be shared by Catholics and Protestants. Right? Ideas that can be shared by, that are relevant to all Irish people, regardless of the religious sect that they belong to. And so this is one of the reasons why these early Yeats poems that you look at are so focused on things like fairies, right? The idea is to fill these poems with content that will resonate with both an Irish Catholic and with an Irish Protestant. So figures from myth, figures from legend. There was something I was about to say, and so Sligo, where Yeats's grandparents lived, and which had a great deal of influence on his early work in particular, is about here in Ireland. So it's in kind of like the northwest part of the country. And most of the locations mentioned in The Stolen Child are in and around Sligo. So he really does kind of use this place as an imaginative locus for particularly his early poetry. So can I get a volunteer on page 212 to start reading The Stolen Child for us?
Where dips the rocky highland of Soothwood in the lake, there lies the leafy island where flapping herons awake. The drowsy water rest, There we pit our fairy vats, full of berries and red stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild with the fairy hand in hand. For the world's more full of weeping than you can understand.
All right, Alex, pick it up.
For the wave of moonlight glosses, the dim gray sands of night, far off that furthest crosses, we flitted overnight, weaving olden dances, mingling hands and mingling dances. So the moon has taken flight to and fro in the leaves, and chased the frothy bubbles, while the world is full of troubles, and is anxious in its sea. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, to the very hand in hand, where the world's more full of weeping than you can understand.
Valencia.
By the wandering water gushes from the hills above, blank hard and pools among the rushes, that scarce could breathe a star, seek for slumber, trout, and whispering in their ears, give them unquiet dreams, with leaning softly out from ferns that drop their tears. Over the young streams, come away, O human child, to the waters of the wild, with the fairy head in hand, for the world was full of weeping things.
Megan.
Away with us he's going, with solemn eyes. He'll hear no more the lowing of the calves on the warm hillside, or the kettle on the hob sing peace into his breast, or see the brown mice bob round and round the oatmeal chest, for he comes, the human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, from a world more full of weeping than he can understand.
All right, thanks, guys. Good job. So, does anybody know what kind of like folklore or myth pattern this poem is based on? Do any of you know what a changeling is? Have any of you ever heard of this before? This is not a familiar concept? Okay, so according to European folklore, sort of broadly speaking, although there are also similar stories in African folklore, the fairies, in order to kind of renew their stock over time, will sometimes steal human children to raise as their own and leave either a fairy or a magic block of wood or something in the place of the child, right? So the changeling legend is about the fairies stealing a child from our world and bringing it into their own, right? Usually leaving some kind of copy in its place. So let's look at the way the fairies make their pitch here. Like, what kind of life does it sound like the fairies lead? What kinds of things do they do? Okay, they talk to fish, right? There's actually something a little bit creepy about the way they talk to the fish, right? We seek for slumbering trout and whisper in their ear, giving them unquiet dreams, right? So they like giving sleeping fish nightmares. We'll talk about that in a second. But what other sorts of activities do the fairies describe? Like, what sorts of things do they do?
Did they, it says something about leaning softly out from ferns that drop their tears. Does that have something to do with what they were doing?
Leaning softly out from ferns that drop their tears over the years. Well, think about more in terms of like kind of like general activities. Like, what activities do we actually see them performing here?
They're dancing.
Yeah, they dance, right? Yeah, they dance all night, right? What do they eat? Yeah, stolen cherries, right? They've got fairy vats full of berries and reddest stolen cherries, right? So they eat berries and cherries. And on the whole, it sounds like, the life they lead primarily is one of carefree partying, right? out like out in the middle of an island in the lake, right? I think this island, right, the fact that this is on an island is important because an island is isolated, right? An island is cut off from normal life on land, right? So on an island here, things are possible imaginatively that are not possible on land. But I think Valencia already noted there's something a little bit darker going on here as well, right? That do the fairies seem like they're necessarily nice? First off, what's the title of the poem?
Stolen child.
The Stolen Child, right? You know, implying, taken, tricked, right? And where do they get the food they eat?
They steal it.
They steal it. And they like doing they like doing unpleasant things to fish, right? So there is a subtle undercurrent of malice here in the fairies' activity. And I think that this actually comes out most fully in the final stanza of the poem that Megan read. So, what does the life the child was leaving behind look like? Away with us he's going, the solemn-eyed. He'll hear no more the lowing of the calves on the warm hillside, or the kettle on the hob sing peace into his breast, or see the brown mice bob round and round the oatmeal chest.
Sound like a farm, maybe?
Yeah. So yeah, it's rural agricultural life, right? Yeah, probably on a farm. And does it sound like it's that bad?
No.
It sounds pretty peaceful and comfortable, right? So essentially what's happening here is that the child is trading in peace and comfort for the more varied thrills, the more imaginative thrills of the fairy island, right? But we end with this because there has to be a sense of what the child is giving up to get those things, right? You give up this peace, you give up this security, you give up the lowing of the calves on the warm hillside in order to dance all night, whisper nasty things to trout, and eat stolen fruit, right? So this is actually kind of part of a major dichotomy in Yeats's early work. He often juxtaposes the mundane, everyday world with a world of magic that is kind of overlaid on top of it, right? And they touch at certain points. And people who have experience of both are unable to find rest or comfort. So we kind of see something similar going on if we turn to The Man Who Dreamed of Fairyland on page 216. He stood among a crowd at Drumahair. His heart hung all upon a silken dress. And he had known at last some tenderness, before earth took him to her stony care. But when a man poured fish into a pile, it seemed they raised their little silver heads, and sang what gold morning or evening sheds upon a woven world forgotten isle, where people love beside the ravelled seas. The time can never mar a lover's vows, under that woven changeless roof of boughs. The singing shook him out of his new ease. He wandered by the sands of Lissadell, His mind ran all in money cares and fears. And he had known at last some prudent years, before they heaped his grave under the hill. But while he passed before a plashy place, a lugworm with its gray and muddy mouth sang that somewhere to north or west or south there dwelt a gay, exulting, gentle race under the golden or the silver skies. But if a dancer stayed his hungry foot, it seemed the sun and moon were in the fruit. And at that singing he was no more wise. He mused beside the well of Scandinavin. He mused upon his mockers without fail. His sudden vengeance were a country tale when earthy night had drunk his body in. But one small knot grass growing by the pool sang where a necessary cruel voice. Old silence bids its chosen race rejoice. Whatever rabbled waters rise and fall, or stormy silver fret the gold of day. And midnight there enfold them like a fleece, and lover there by lover be at peace. The tale drove his fine angry mood away. He slept under the hill of Lugnagal, and might have known at last unhaunted sleep. Under that cold and vapor-turbaned steep, now that the earth had taken man and all, did not the worms that spired about his bones proclaim with that unwearied reedy cry that God has laid his fingers on the sky, that from those fingers glittering summer runs upon the dancer by the dreamless wave? Why should those lovers that no lovers miss dream until God burn nature with a kiss? The man has found no comfort in the grave. So the structure of each of these stanzas is basically the same, right? What happens in the first few lines of each stanza?
He changed different places. He was somewhere else.
Okay, yeah, he's always in a different place, right? Now, but all of these places are real locations in and around County Sligo. But what is he typically doing in these places? Is he doing anything weird or unusual, typically in the first part of the stanza? So in the first one, right, his heart hung all upon a silken dress, right? And he at last had known some tenderness. So what's happening there?
Is he in a dress?
No, he is not in a dress.
I thought maybe he was sad about something.
If his heart hung all upon a silken dress, and he had known at last some tenderness, what does that suggest?
Maybe he found somebody that he related.
It's talking about falling in love, right?
Oh, okay.
And then what happens in the rest of the stanza? So we've got something perfectly normal, right? And then
Then it says, before earth took him to her stony care.
yeah, well that's kind of where the normal part ends, right? So it's talking like all of this happened before he died, before he went into the grave. And then what happens?
Oh, he died?
Yeah, he's dead at the end of the poem.
Oh, I
I thought-
think that's,
I didn't know.
Yeah, the last stanza describes him, in the grave, right? The worms spiring about his bones, all that.
oh, I
Yeah.
don't think that's what happened.
Yeah, he's buried. Yeah, it describes that he's buried under. When he knows unhaunted sleep, right? He's buried under the hill there. That's what they're talking about there. But if we just stick to this first stanza here, right? We get something perfectly normal, right? And then something weird happens. He's walking around, thinking about this girl that he loves, and then a guy a fisherman pours a pile of fish out from a basket, and the fish raise their little heads and start talking, right? We see the same kind of pattern throughout the poem, right? In the second stanza, he's thinking about his money worries. And then a lugworm, which is a creature kind of like a leech, looks up at him and starts singing, right? So these animals, these creatures in nature, do things they're not supposed to be doing, right? And tell him about a world beyond the one that he lives in, the one that he's concerned with and worried about, right? He mused beside the well of Scandinavin, he mused upon his mockers without fail. His sudden vengeance were a country tale, when earthy night had drunk his body in. but one small knot grass growing by the pool sang where a necessary cool voice, right? So we see what's happening each time here, right? Some kind of creature or natural object starts telling him about a reality beyond his own. And what's the effect on him of all of this?
Is he shocked by it?
It seemed like he was upset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At the end of each stanza, right, it talks about how unsettled he is by this, right? So because he's forced to live in one world and is, keeps getting these weird echoes of another, right? This fairyland that he dreams of. He can't have peace in either, right? And generally the way I read these two poems together is that they're both talking about the artist. They're talking about the way the artist sees visions of another world that have to be translated into the mundane materials of this world, right? And the difficulty that the artist experiences in really kind of living you can't live solely in the world of the imagination, because then, you won't take care of yourself, you'll starve to death, right? But when you try to live solely in the world of everyday mundane reality, and these other things keep calling to you, right? That's unsustainable too, right? You'll go mad, you'll get depressed, whatever. And even in death, this guy who sees these visions of another world, right, can't find any peace. So, what we have here is kind of like a description of the artist's relationship with the natural world, right? The same thing is going on in The Stolen Child with the fairies, right? In order to get all of this cool, fun stuff from the world of imagination, you have to give up your peaceful, comfortable farm life. And you can't really go back to it. So most of Yeats's early poetry is kind of built on this barrier between the world of myth and imagination and the world of the ordinary and the everyday. And then about midway through his career, he makes a shift and stops writing about all this kind of stuff altogether. So can we turn to page 219? Can I get somebody to read a quote for us? It's short, so just read the whole poem.
Make mine a song of coat, covered with embroideries out of my old mythologies, from head to throat, but the fool's talk. Worn in the world's eyes as though they brought it. Song, let them take it. For those more enterprising walking with it. For there's more enterprise walking with it.
Yes. Thank you. So, what's going on in this poem? What's he talking about? What's that? Okay, he has a coat. And what is the coat a metaphor for? Yeah.
Oh, I thought that was
Yeah.
I thought it was
Yeah, the coat is a metaphor for his writing, right? And what did this coat look like?
All mythologies.
Yeah, it's embroidered with images out of old mythology, right? And what does he do with this coat? Why is he not wearing the coat anymore? Yes, these fools stole it from him, right? So, who are these fools, do we think? What do we think, if the coat is a metaphor for writing, who are these fools who stole the coat from him? Yeah, he's talking about other writers, right, who are imitating his style and his methods, right? So yeah, he's attacking his imitators. Song, let them take it, for there's more enterprise in walking naked. So essentially, what he's doing here, right, is signaling a change in his methods and style as a poet, right? I'm not going to do this myth and folklore stuff anymore. It's overdone, and it's really just something that was a kind of, outer garment over the things that I was really trying to express, right? So there's more enterprise in walking naked, right? Like, I can say the things that I want to say more clearly without covering it up with all of this mythological symbolism, right? Now, the thing is that, as you probably noticed, Yeats's poetry doesn't necessarily become any more clear after this point in his career. So this is 1914. He's roughly 50 years old, and he will continue to write for another 25 years. He lives and writes for a very long time. He's very prolific. So what he starts developing in the 1920s, a few years after writing this poem, is a kind of philosophy of history. And he uses that as the new basis on which he starts writing his poetry. Now, bear with me for a minute because, like I said, this is going to sound completely batshit nuts, right? So Yeats envisions history as being essentially like two eternally spinning cones, which he calls gyres. And these gyres are constantly rotating into and out of each other. One gyre he labels objective. The other he labels subjective. So the objective gyre of history is concerned with things like order, conformity, and the group. The subjective gyre is concerned with the individual, with heroism, and with disorder. And one gyre will always be dominant in any given era. And when he's talking about eras, he's talking about like periods of usually about hundreds of years, right? And he believes himself to be living at the end of an objective era and the beginning of a new subjective era. Now, much of this he also connects to phases of the moon in a manner that's kind of similar to astrology, right? He argues that he basically assigns meaning to particular phases of the moon, and then says that certain friends and acquaintances of his belong to particular moon phases. This is just the whole system is just it's bizarre, right? And I should point out as well that this is also unique to Yeats, right? Nobody else ever believed this shit. Yeats himself was very much interested in the occult, and he came up with this system largely through conversations using his wife as a medium, right? So they claimed they were talking to a spirit who was giving them these revelations. Yes?
What is the occult?
Okay, the occult. When we talk about the occult, occult literally means something like secret wisdom, but we would associate it with sort of like the supernatural or the paranormal. So ghosts, magic, things like that, right? Yeats also was a member of a group called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, to give it its full title. And they were kind of like Freemasons in late Victorian London, only they actually claimed to practice magic, right? So they dressed up in funny robes and waved staffs around and drew magic circles and claimed to be wizards. This is
Like role playing?
no, because they thought they were. It's not like LARPing because they thought it was real.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. It's not like they were role playing.
Yeah. I mean, like it sounds to us like Dungeons and Dragons, right? But
Right.
to these guys, it was actually very real and very serious. A lot of people in the late 19th century were looking for alternative modes of spirituality. They found the Anglican Church and other avenues of conventional Christianity unsatisfying. And so, they were looking for something else. So there were a lot of groups who kind of appropriated various kinds of South and East Asian mythologies for their own particular uses. What the Order of the Golden Dawn did was essentially try to cast spells out of medieval magic books. But yeah, so Yeats was already kind of primed to believe in this sort of thing, right? So he would sit with his wife in the evenings, and she would write messages that were supposedly coming to her from the spirits. Now, it has been argued by some who are of a more cynical or skeptical turn of mind that Mrs. Yeats was just basically trying to keep her husband interested. There was a huge age gap between them, and at least initially they didn't seem to have much in common. But she knew that he was obsessed with ghosts and things like that. There are often things in the notes that say things like, the medium is thirsty and would like a glass of water, right? That are supposedly messages from the spirit, but are clearly Mrs. Yeats indicating, that she's tired, or that she's thirsty, or that she's ready for a break, right? So this affects both of the later poems that I had you guys read. So both Easter 1916 and The Second Coming. The Second Coming is, in a lot of ways, a kind of direct expression of this philosophy in poetry. Of kind of the moment when these cycles change over. Easter 1916 is related more specifically to an Irish political event. So, in 1916, Britain is deeply embroiled in the First World War, right? So a group of Irish nationalists decide to stage a revolt during Easter week of 1916, figuring that the British government is busy, the army is busy elsewhere, and that this is as good a time as any to form our independent Irish Republic, right? So they go to the post office on O'Connell Street in Dublin. The building is still there. You can actually still see the way the facade of the building is marred by bullets and cannon fire. They hole up in a couple of locations around Dublin. They take over the post office, they take over a biscuit factory, they take over a couple of different positions. And they're able to hold out for a week before the army comes in and captures them. And for most of the time that this is going on, the vast majority of the population of Ireland considers these people at best a ridiculous nuisance. no one takes them seriously. Everybody thinks that this is more or less absurd. And then the British government goes and does something that changes people's minds. They execute the leaders of the revolt by firing squad. And in some cases, this strikes people as so particularly cruel that it builds sympathy for the independence movement, right? So one of the leaders, for example, was a guy by the name of James Connolly. Connolly was a socialist organizer and a labor leader, and had been badly wounded in the fighting. So when he was executed, his arm was broken, it was badly infected, he was slightly delirious, and he was so sick that he couldn't stand. So they had to tie him to a chair in order to execute him. And this struck people, like Connolly's execution in particular, struck people as so vicious and so extreme that it changed public opinion and built momentum for political separatism. And that's kind of like what that change in attitude is what Easter 1916 is primarily about, right? So if we look at the first stanza of this on page 221. All right, can I get somebody to read this for us? Starting with, I have met them at close of day.
I have met them at close of day, some with Jewish faces, from counter and desk among her 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head, or polite meaningless words, or I have lingered a while and said polite meaningless words. And thought before I had done, of a mouthy tale of God, to please a companion around the fire at a club, being certain that they and I but believe mobily is warm, all change up with a terrible beauty.
Okay, thank you. So, what's Yeats in this stanza telling us about his initial attitude towards these revolutionaries? These were all people he knew.
He was nice and just spoke just because he seemed them.
Yeah, I mean, he knew them well enough to say hello, right? They would exchange polite, meaningless words. But did he take them seriously? Yeah, while he's exchanging these polite, meaningless words, he's also privately snickering at them, right? And thinking of ways that he can make fun of them later with his friends sitting at their club, right? It's like, oh yeah, I ran into that asshole Patrick Pierce today, and guess what he said, right? Being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn, right? So motley, right? You know, the clothing of the court jester, right? This all seemed like a big joke until they put this into action and died for it, right? And the second stanza describes particular leaders of this movement, right? So the first one, the woman whose days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers when young and beautiful she rode to harriers? Is a woman who Yeats had actually known for most of her life. Constance Gore Markiewicz. Gore Booth is her maiden name. Markiewicz was her married name. She married a Polish count. And she was herself a member of that Anglo-Irish ascendancy class like Yeats. Her family were wealthy landlords in the west of Ireland. But she became associated with the labor movement, which then kind of tied itself into the nationalist movement. And Yeats's preferred memory of her is not of the labor agitator spending her nights in argument until her voice grows shrill, right? He remembers her instead as, you know, a young and beautiful woman who liked fox hunting. So, you know, that aristocratic pursuit seems to be kind of what he prefers. Yeats is a terrible snob. This man kept a school and rode our winged horse. The other, his helper and his friend, was coming into his force. So these two individuals are Patrick Pearse and Thomas MacDonagh, who were poets and academics. Pearse ran an Irish language school for boys, which also instructed them in militant nationalism. And MacDonagh was a professor of literature at University College Dublin. So Yeats seems to be arguing here that maybe these guys should have stuck to poetry. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought, right? So these lives are basically wasted in this effort. This other man I had dreamed, a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who were near my heart. Yet I number him in the song. This is John McBride, who had married the woman that Yeats basically spent his whole life pining for. And had been active in revolutionary, in like physical force revolutionary activities for quite some time. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. And that terrible beauty being born that we get at the end of just about every stanza here is this kind of change in historical cycles, right? The subjective gyre overtaking the objective gyre and bringing in a new historical era, right? Which, as we see in the Second Coming, means an eruption of violence, right? An eruption of chaos before things settle down. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range, from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim, and a horse plashes within it. The long-legged moorhens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of it all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. So let's think about this image of the stone that is central to the next to last stanza and then carries over into the final stanza. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. What seems to be interesting to Yeats here about a stone, specifically? How is a stone different from the other things he describes in that stanza? Yeah, a stone is unchanging and unmoving, right? Right? You throw a stone into the middle of a stream, and the stream is going to change around it, right? But the stone itself will remain, at least initially, will remain unmoved, right? And how are these people he's talking about like a stone?
Because they don't change.
Yeah, because they're so committed to this particular ideology, right? That nothing shakes them. So these ideologically committed people are the stone troubling the living stream, right? Forcing change around them, but not changing themselves, right? Remaining themselves unmoved. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of it all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part to murmur name upon name, as a mother names her child, when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. Now this is interesting. Like, why do you think he compares the naming of these revolutionaries who died to a mother naming a child?
Did they like start the
carrying on a movement that started in the mid-19th century. Remember, we talked last time about that feeding revolt in 1867, right? So at least they would have connected themselves to that particular movement. Who are the children here? To murmur name upon name as a mother names her child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. It's not animals, no. He's talking, remember, he's talking here about the relationship between these revolutionaries and the broader Irish public, right? Who's the mother, who's the child in this analogy? Well, I mean, whose names are getting listed out at the end of this? Yeah, so the names that are getting listed out, the names that are being recited are those of the revolutionaries, right? So who's the mother and who's the child in the analogy? Who's the child? Yeah, the revolutionaries are the child, right? So, when sleep has come to limbs that had run wild, right? So they went and lived and did their thing and are now asleep, right? Why do you think Yeats is comparing them to children? What does this suggest about the way he still thinks? Is he quite able to bring himself to think of these people as serious or as heroes? Yeah, I think that he takes them more seriously than he did, right? But I think there is also still a sense here that he regards them and their cause as a little bit immature, right? And that the revolution was premature. And that, we should take them up into our arms like a mother takes a wayward child to sing it to sleep, right? That they should be remembered and loved and cared for, but at the same time, there's still a sense that their ideas are underdeveloped or immature, right? Okay, so we're about at a time here, so we're going to stop there. We're going to be picking up with similar themes when we talk about James Joyce, but from a different perspective, right? Because Joyce is coming from that Catholic middle class that Yeats is in many ways opposed to, right? So he's writing from that particular perspective.